weeks. We had a chance, Tony and I did on Friday evening after all the voting deadlines had expired in the different processes that the small groups designed, to look at the recommendations that came out, and across an incredible set of differences of stakeholder perspectives, we were really pleased and surprised by the amount of overlap that was there. So we're going to go through kind of item by item on the big policy questions, what we saw in the recommendations from each of the 4 groups. That will be the first part of our agenda today, is just kind of a review of the kind of bullet point summary of each of the 4 groups' recommendations. But we are hopeful that we will move right from there into actually deliberating and voting on some of the items that there was a lot of agreement on, if not all 4 of the groups, that 3 or more of the 4 had agreement on. And then separately, taking up all the items that there wasn't agreement on. And just for clarity right from the beginning, the biggest issue identified in many of the groups that there's disagreement on is vacancy control, vacancy decontrol. But there's a number of other items that also, appeared in one group's recommendation, but not the other 3, or where there's contrasting recommendations from different groups. And we'll try to take each of those up on its own merits and get as far as we can get in a 2-hour meeting today. I don't know whether it's realistic to think we can get all the way through all those items in 2 hours. And if not, then we'll meet again next week and pick up wherever we leave off today. But we hope to at least be able to get through some of the biggest pieces. The ones, first of all, a bundle of items that there was quite a bit of overlap among the 4 reports on. And then secondly, a separate discussion about decontrol. So I'm going to lead through the first 2 parts, which is an overview of the recommendations from the 4 groups, number 1, and then number 2, this kind of bundle of things there was quite a bit of overlap on. And hopefully we'll have some debate and take that to a vote here in the meeting today. And then Tony will take over on the next 2 items, which is decontrol as a very high priority piece that there is real disagreement about within our group, and then all of the other items that there's either disagreement on or only some of us had a recommendation on. So that is our process for the day. And Ed, do you have the table of summary that you can share? Great, thank you. Is there a way to make that bigger? Wonder if we can focus in on the top and then kind of scroll down or something. Yeah, great. Thank you. And yeah, if you can just scroll back up to the top. So first, just sort of what is here before we get into any of the specifics. What we are presenting here is the package of proposals that got the most support in each of the 4 groups. There are very important differences in the processes that the different groups engaged in to get to what's presented here. Just want to acknowledge that. Everybody's coming in today having had a very different experience depending on which of the 4 groups you were in. We didn't run the same processes, we didn't vote in the same ways, and importantly, we didn't compromise to the same degrees. We told everyone beforehand that all the voting would be public and your name could be associated with your vote. So I hope that you've heard that and saw that in our emails in the past. That's not a surprise. But because that's the case, we thought it would be helpful to just put the names of the people who voted for these packages here, both to be clear about who did support them and also who didn't support them. There were alternative proposals in 3 of the 4 groups that are not presented here because they did not have as many votes. And what you will notice, especially if you've gotten to know other members of the task force over the time that we've met together, is that some of these lists involve people who maybe started in very different or even opposed positions on rent stabilization and some of the policy particulars, and others of these groups don't look that way. So that's an important factor to just bear in mind. But really, more importantly, from our perspective, once looking at them, is how much there is some overlap, not in all of them, but in many of them, on some of the key questions. And so that's sort of what we'll dig into. The other kind of just overall point to make here, and it's at the bottom of the top row, you see the number of proposals voted on. So because we didn't have a standardized process across the groups, and the groups kind of came up with their own. Thank you, Jay. Jay is noting that his name should be on the group too, and that would change the number and the percentage as well. Thank you, Jay. And I see a text from two. So which of, did you vote in favor of one of these proposals too? Are you able to come off mute too and answer? Clara, did
I don't know which, I wasn't sure which proposal I vote for. I know I voted for a proposal, but I'm just saying my name is not part of the group.
I see, yes, yep. So let me just clarify that, because this may answer Maisha's comment as well. This is only the names of the people who voted in favor of. So if you voted for a different proposal that didn't get the majority in your small group, your name won't be here. But Jay was saying he voted for proposal 2, which was the proposal that went forward in our group. So if there's any others of those corrections, please speak up or put them in the chat. So the point I was going to make at the bottom of the row is that because we didn't have a standardized process, different groups voted on different numbers of proposals. So the number of votes and percentage isn't really apples to apples, because if your group only voted on one proposal, in the case of group 4, that's a very different kind of outcome than if your group voted on 4 proposals, as the group I was in did, group 2. So for whatever it's worth, just pointing that out, it's not really apples to apples, but what you see here, what got the most votes in each group, and who are the people who voted for it. And if there's any other corrections to that list, please make them. So going down, I'll just go kind of group by group. The first group in their package that got the most support had a 3% rent cap, full vacancy decontrol, so no limits on the amount that could be charged at the point of a change of tenants. I'm going to skip over reasonable rate of return, a 15-year new construction exemption, an exemption for income restricted or subsidized housing. Then under implementation, free workshops to be available for property owners related to compliance. And in the other category, as you'll see in some of the other groups as well, calling for just cause protections for tenants. So that is the group 1 proposal. Again, this was, supported by 5 out of 9. There was an alternative proposal supported by 4 out of 9 that had some overlap and some very important differences. But since that got the most votes, that's what we're presenting here. Group 2, we, as I mentioned before, had 4 proposals that we voted on in the end, although people were allowed to vote for more than one. It was just vote for any that you support. Also had a 3% rent cap, set a very limited form of vacancy decontrol, specifically up to the amount of any accumulated preferential banking. And then that's the form of banking that was in that set of recommendations. It also had called for a 15-year new construction exemption, and also called for exempting subsidized units of affordable housing. Under implementation, this is another of these sort of one-off items that only appears in one of the 4 sets of recommendations. Our group called for a registry, as many cities with rent stabilization have. We, like group 1, called for just cause protections for tenants. And then finally, another one-off that doesn't appear in the other groups, assistance support for any tenants who are dislocated or relocated through the application of this policy, or the implementation of this policy. I'm just seeing a note from C. Terrence. C. Terrence, can you get that correction to Ed, since he's the one screen sharing?
Yep, I can do that. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you. Group 3, 6 out of 10 of the members of that group voted for a package that would have a 3% rent cap. Like group 1, would have a full vacancy decontrol, would have a limited form of banking up to 5 years and with a requirement to notify tenants, would exempt utilities costs and property tax costs, or establish a pass-through for those costs that could be passed on to renters, in other words. On reasonable rate of return, specified as self-certification being acceptable for increases of between 4 and 10%. Called for a 30-year exemption on new construction. Also called for exempting subsidized units, affordable housing. Called for exempting owner-occupied duplexes. Called for exempting units that provide care or services, in addition to just housing. For implementation, they specified a recommendation that this be staff-run, i.e. not creating an elected board. Called for educational programming to make sure that both tenants and property owners, and everybody else for that matter, knows their rights and obligations under the ordinance. And under other, called for renter stability provisions in rent stabilized units. So not the same as the call for just cause in the other 3 groups, but a kind of in a sort of related measure specific to rent stabilized units. Group 4, which is the one that only voted on one proposal, had 6 of 9 in support. Also called for a 3% cap, and very similar language to group 2, called for a version of decontrol, of partial decontrol, that is specifically limited to the amount of any accumulated preferential banking. Called for the reasonable rate of return to be as is. That was, if I remember correctly, explicit in their proposal. Called for a 15-year new construction exemption, but then further specified adaptive reuse and limited the retroactivity of that 15-year new construction exemption, so it wouldn't just automatically go back minus 15 years from when it went into effect. Protection, called for another one-off, called for protection from NOAA demolitions. Important difference here in the next section, they explicitly did not exempt, I can't remember how to pronounce the acronym, LIHTC, or other subsidized affordable housing stock. And then, like groups 1 and 2, also called for just cause protections. So before we get into the next piece of talking about the areas of considerable overlap here and trying to get into debate and vote on those, just want to pause and see, Are there questions? If you were in a group and I said something wrong, I apologize. Please correct the record. This is just our best attempt to turn it into, very short bullet points. So the floor is open if there are questions or comments on any of what's just been summarized. See the question from Thomas in the chat. Are there 40 task force members and only 37 votes?
Yes, because I was just going to answer that. There was one member of my group I couldn't get in. We didn't get in touch with, and so they technically didn't vote. Their vote's not represented in group 4. So there's actually 10 members of group 4, but one of them I didn't get in touch with.
I think that was true for group 2 as well, that one of our members didn't vote.
Same in group 1 was similar.
Good question. Other questions or comments before we move forward? Okay, not seeing any at the moment. Ed, can you switch to the version with highlighter? There we go, thank you. Okay, so in our discussion, after looking at all of these, here is what Tony and I suggest we take up as a bundle where there's not consensus. It's not, not going to say that it's consensus, but there is quite a bit of overlap among these 4 reports, even given all the differences of our process, and even given the differences in, whether there was compromise between people who started off disagreeing reflected in the packages. Still, there's quite a bit of overlap in the packages themselves. And I just want to clarify again that there is considerable disagreement and clearly a lot of priority for a lot of people from different perspectives here on decontrol, and we are going to take that up right after this because there clearly is not a strong majority position out of the, what you see summarized for the 4 recommendations there. And we didn't want to try to weigh in on all the different items here, just the ones where we saw it in at least 3 of the reports, or in the case, to come back to it now, of reasonable rate of return, where we know from the facilitators in the discussions that this was talked about in all the groups, and where groups were silent on it, we believe anyway that there was kind of an assumption that reasonable rate of return will be continuing. And of course, like everything else, that's open to discussion here. And if that's wrong, we can take it out. But we believe that that's the case, that from the discussion in the groups, there's a common understanding that we would like to see that continue. So the 5 elements are the setting the rent cap at 3%, as is true of the existing ordinance that kind of amazingly appeared in all 4 sets of recommendations. Having a recommendation that there be a form of banking established. There are some differences in the kind of banking here, and we could certainly tease those out and get to a more specific vote, but in this package, we're just saying including banking, because it seems like that is something that there's a lot of support for among different people on the task force. That the reasonable rate of return policy continue. And then 3 of the 4 groups had the same number of years, 15 years as their recommendation for a new construction exemption. So we're including that here as part of this bundle or package. And in the case of group 4, it does not include the additional language of group 4. Again, that would be perfectly subject to further discussion as we get into more of the specifics. But for now, it's just a 15-year new construction exemption. And then finally, and this is it, it's under the other column here for a reason, calling on city lawmakers to adopt just cause protections for renters. This was not part of our explicit charge. It is something that came up a lot in our task force process, and especially in the small groups. Clearly, there's a history that's important here. And by calling for just cause protections for renters, that doesn't mean re-adopting the same language that the city attempted to establish a few years ago. It means taking a fresh look at the kind of legal terrain and determining what's possible, but that the intention from a number of members of the task force, and it was reflected in 3 of the reports, is to have some amount of protection established for renters in terms of just cause. And I see a question in the chat. So Cecile is saying that 3 of the 4 groups want to essentially exempt affordable housing. Why is that not highlighted? That is a good question. If I remember right, while groups 2 and 3 had the same recommendation on that, group 1's was a bit different, but can somebody either from group 1 or one of the Cura staff, is that right? Or is group 1's just a different way of saying the same thing as groups 2 and 3?
Yeah, you know, we want to exempt affordable housing, Section 8, government funded programs.
Yep. Thank you. That's helpful, Chu. I guess maybe my question is more to Ed or C. Terrence. I just don't remember. If group 1's recommendation is effectively the same as group 2 and group 3's, then I would agree with Cecile's suggestion to add that, but I just don't know if that's the case.
And maybe I could just say one thing on the LURA was just a quick way of saying it's a land use regulatory agreement. I mean, this would have to be spelled out more, but essentially, if it's income and rent restricted, it has a LURA on it, generally speaking. So that's where that was kind of the shorthand for more language. So when I see income restricted housing, that's what a LURA does.
I wonder, Tony Damiano, are you able to look at the specific language that was voted in group 1 and determine whether it really fits with what Cecile just described? Or anyone?
Well, it looks like it just may be similar enough that we can sort of agree that there was a feeling that in one form or another, some types of income restricted housing or subsidized housing should be covered. So I think if we agree in that kind of broad sense, then perhaps they should 3 be highlighted.
Okay. It seems like, I mean, thank you for the question and suggestion, Cecile. It sounds totally reasonable. I just feel like someone should just double check the writing of group 1's recommendation, make sure that it's close enough. And if that's true, then including that makes sense. And am I remembering right, Tony Damiano, that was your group? Or I see Catherine, who was in that group, has her hand up. Go ahead, Catherine.
I think the problem is that people don't really understand what the LIHTC is, how it's structured, how it actually affects people. I remember us going back and forth with that in our group. So when you say income restricted, it's just really Section 8 and Section 42 are completely different. I can say what just happened to our building because of this, but I'll say it at some point. I don't know if this is the time to say it.
Thanks, Catherine. So I guess I would suggest, I mean, we were intending to take this one up first after decontrol, given the kind of strong views expressed on it and the fact that there may be some nuance of difference between the different groups. So I guess I would say let's move forward the 5 that we had highlighted initially, knowing that this is teed up for a conversation. And, you know, I think there is some significant overlap, it sounds like, between group 1 on the one hand and groups 2 and 3 on the other. But we can look at that more closely. I see Robbie's hand is up.
Thank you, Chairman. I have just one concern, and that is that I think without the discussion about vacancy decontrol, when we're talking about the rent cap, and I just know this for me personally, my opinion on that rent cap is based on my opinion for that vacancy decontrol. So if that's not there, then my personal opinion on that rent cap would change, and I would be curious if that would be the same for the other people in those groups that voted for that. For instance, initially, we talked about adding on the rate of inflation or CPI, that type of thing. So it was, from my standpoint, kind of a concession, to try to get to vacancy decontrol. So just a concern I have that if we don't know how that part of the policy is going to be, is that rent cap actually going to be a true statement?
So totally reasonable point. And I saw somebody else said something similar in the chat. We are looking at the results that came out of the 4 groups in the packages and identifying some pretty strong areas of agreement in the case of the rent cap, in all 4 of them. If someone feels like the only way that I could support any of these pieces is having it tied to something else that isn't highlighted here, then I think you just have to decide what's appropriate in terms of how you want to vote. I will say on the biggest issue that isn't highlighted here of decontrol or control, I think it's noteworthy that none of the groups recommended full vacancy control. I would say that for when we get to that discussion, I think that end of the spectrum sort of isn't reflected here. And I know that there's people on the task force who feel just as upset about that as others feel about what you were just naming, Robbie. So, there's a lot of compromise that's already happened that showed up in these small group reports. But there's clearly strong disagreement on decontrol. And so that's why we've suggested taking the items where we see more of that overlap. And I saw somebody else's hand up, but then maybe went down. Is there someone else with a hand up? So, Chu, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, with our proposal, the rent cap 3% was only contingent upon full vacancy decontrol. So if we don't have full vacancy decontrol, we will not support the 3% cap. It'll be 3% plus CPI. For me.
Understood. Yep, similar to the last comment. I see Catherine and then B.
I just wanted to say that Tony Damiano just came back online and he was facilitating our group. So I don't know, Tony, if you want to jump in with this quagmire that we're trying to figure out in group 1.
Well, he may have missed the question if he was dealing with other things. Did you hear the question?
No, if you repeat the question, I can do my best to clarify.
Great. So this is on the other housing stock exemptions line. Cecile made the good point that it looks like there's 3 of 4 in agreement on this, but we know that 2 and 3 said something very similar, but we weren't sure if what group 1 meant by income restricted housing being exempted is substantively similar to group 2 and 3's recommendations. And if you don't know, that's okay, but do you know?
Yeah, to the best of my recollection, obviously, if I'm wrong, correct me, was that we were talking about exempting housing where rent is explicitly based on a percentage of income. So our example would be exempting Section 8 or project-based Section 8 and Section 8 housing, but not exempting LIHTC. No exemptions for LIHTC because there was specific concerns of people in our group about having much larger rent, who have experienced much larger rent increases, even while living in LIHTC housing.
Okay, thank you, Tony. That's very helpful. So I think we should unhighlight that because it's 2 out of 4 in agreement, but it's very much open for further discussion and a vote, on its own terms a little later in the process. B is up next.
Yeah, I just want to state the fact that the 3% cap was voted for like all across the board. So I don't really understand why we're continuing to have a conversation about it as if it's going to be up for negotiations. So I would really, really appreciate, given the fact that we're already 35 minutes into this process, that we just move on and talk about the vacancy control and the other exemptions, because I feel like it's personally derailing a whole conversation for you to be like, oh, it's attached to this, when like you already voted for it and we're already in this discussion and it was agreed upon on all 4 groups. So that is just what I have to say about that. I would like us to just move on into this discussion around control and other exemptions for housing.
Okay, thanks, B. We'll go to Chu, and then I'd like to try to move us towards, debate on this package and then a vote. Go ahead, Chu.
Yeah, I don't agree with what B said. We made it very clear that the 3% was tied to vacancy decontrol in our group. If we didn't have vacancy decontrol, like I said, it would have been higher. It would have been 3% plus CPI. So I just want to make that clear.
So thank you, Chu. And I would just say, yes, all the groups had their own processes. They're not all the same. We can't make assumptions from one to another about sort of how the discussion went. I think in many groups, it is accurate to say that they were all tied together, right? That was the task, was come up with a package as comprehensive as you could. And most groups came up with something quite comprehensive, and it was all tied together. And I'll just speak, from my experience, we had to engage in really substantive compromise to get support from people who started off with different views on pieces to get to a compromise package. I know that was different in different groups, but regardless, the result here in each of these 4 cases is a bundle that's kind of tied together based on whatever process and compromise you used. So not saying anything different from that. Yet when you look at the packages that resulted, there are areas of really striking overlap. And our suggestion is to move 5 of those forward for consideration. Somebody just speaking? I thought I heard a voice.
Yeah, repeat the question. I didn't quite understand.
Oh, I wasn't asking you a question.
Oh.
It sounded like I was. So to repeat then, the kind of proposal on the table is a vote on the 5 items that appeared in 3 or more sets of recommendations bundled together. A 3% rent cap, a call for some version of banking, a call for a reasonable rate of return to continue, 15-year new construction exemption, and just cause protections for renters. Bill, go ahead.
Thanks. Since the rent cap is an issue for 2 of the groups because of what has been talked about, why don't we vote on all the other parts, have the discussion about control, and then vote on the 3% cap after that conversation?
Why would we do that when everyone already voted? Like, if you didn't want the 3% cap, you should have voted no against it. I don't want to have another conversation about this cap anymore. Like, this cap was already voted for and we're already in the discussion. There's like already pieces that are highlighted. So I will not be doing that. If we want to have a conversation about decontrol and other exemptions, cool, let's do that. But let's just move on to the conversation. Why do we want to have a conversation about the 3% when it was already voted for? If you didn't like it, you should have voted for it. So let's move on.
Let me step in. So as we get into deliberation and voting, obviously, people are going to have a lot they want to say. We are going to try to limit comments, not in terms of time, although we really encourage you to speak, as briefly and to the point as possible, but to speak once on each item that's up for debate, not multiple times. So I had not said that yet, but that's what we would suggest for this process going forward. The proposal on the table is these 5 together. I understand you're making a suggestion, Bill, about a different process, but after discussion, looking at the 4 sets of recommendations, I mean, the item that there was the most agreement on was the rent cap, and all of the other ones here was at least 3. So we would like to move ahead with a vote on these 5 together, then take up a discussion of decontrol, and then take up individual discussions of exemptions and all of the other items that are here. But the floor is open then for debate on that proposed vote. Kyrie.
I just want to highlight Tony's question then. Are we voting on these elements right now, that these would be standalone as recommendations from the group, even if we didn't accept anything else? Is that correct, Philip?
Yes, thank you for the clarification. Given the degree of overlap, we're suggesting we get to a vote on the things that there was a lot of overlap on, then take up the big item that we have strong disagreements on, not sure where that will land, then take up all of the other smaller items, including the one that Cecile flagged, and get as far as we can in this meeting and carry into next week if we need to. I see Catherine next.
Oh, can we highlight the other housing stock exemptions? Since it looks like that is a majority want that.
My understanding of what Tony Damiano clarified is that Group 1's recommendation on that is substantively different from Group 2 and Group 3's. And if that's the case and our standard is 3 or more, then it wouldn't get highlighted, if I understood that right.
I thought Tony said that the LIHTC is not included in the construction exemption. Isn't that what you said, Tony?
Yes, it would. LIHTC buildings would be subject to the cap.
And so that recommendation then agrees with Group 4, but not with Groups 2 and 3. Is that making more sense?
Well, we don't want that. I think it's just so confusing because of the double negatives. You know, the LIHTC needs to be not included in the new construction exemption.
So I would just, if you don't mind, Catherine, so we have enough disagreement on that among the 4 reports that I don't think it makes sense to include it as something that there's a lot of overlap on.
Yeah,
we should take it up on its own merits.
Mm-hmm.
Clara.
I'm afraid if we don't get started voting, we're not going to have enough time to discuss anything. And then I'm not coming back next Tuesday. I'm not coming back next Tuesday to discuss anything further out this group. So you as a facilitator need to get the ball rolling, because I thought the process was we vote on stuff and then we have a little discussion and then this is done today. Not keep stalling and having all these conversations. But before they came here, they should have knew what they were voting for. We're not about to change nothing today. It is what it is. So as a facilitator, Tony, let's get the moving. Philip.
Understood. Thank you, Clara. To be fair, the process that we're using today was just laid out at the beginning of the meeting. People are absorbing it and responding to it and asking questions about it, and that's okay. But I take your point. We want to move quickly.
You're still stalling though. You're still stalling. You're letting them have conversations to keep this ball rolling. Let's move on. I'm not sitting here all day listening back and forth. We've been through all this.
I see Kevin has his hand up.
I was just going to suggest that we put the rent cap vote after the decontrol conversation.
Not going to happen.
So that was similar to what somebody said before. Bill, I think, said before. Sorry. Go ahead, Tony.
I was just gonna add, like, I mean, I hear serious disagreement about people. If people really want to vote, you could vote on the package with 3% and decontrol and 3% with no decontrol. I mean, if people really want to say just vote, and they did a package, you know, you're sort of forcing people's hand, and I don't think it would be, you know, as healthy. But you could vote on package A with 3% and decontrol, or 3% and some form of decontrol. And then then everyone has their say. If people really want to go with, let's just vote on the things.
I just want to
because
add that we're getting aside from the point, which is he already has set it out how we're supposed to be voting. And then we're supposed to be coming back talking about decontrol and other issues. So with that being said, if we can really just get down to the voting and
I
then take the other
understand,
issues up,
ma'am. I'm
that would be
going to
awesome.
finish. I'm going to understand what he said, but what a lot of people are saying is they voted on a package. And so if you really want their voice heard, you can vote on the full packages, because they're going to come back and say, well, why don't we just vote on which package we like best?
That's you coming back saying that. That's nobody else saying that right now. That's you. And if we're
Well,
not getting to the voting, then we are stalling. And that is exactly what we're doing. I am here for the people and for the renters. I am not here for nobody else other than that. And so to have to keep going through this is beyond ridiculous, especially after it was already set out and laid out when we first got on this line. I do not appreciate wasting time like this.
So I see other hands up here. Kevin, Chu, Chris, Clara.
All right, my hand was still up, but I said my piece, but this is why Group 1 specifically did not do a vote, a provision by provision, because we recognize that the agreement on 3% was tied to sort of changes on other pieces, the decontrol, for example. And so we very specifically didn't do our votes that way in the group. And I don't think we're going to, I mean, I think a lot of people will vote against 3% if there's no other understandings, if there's no understanding on decontrol. And so I'm not sure that'll get us there. I mean, I understand.
But you're backing out and not compromising. That's what's happening here. We're backing
please,
out and we're not compromising.
Please let me call on people in the order they've raised their hands. We've got a lot of folks who want to weigh in here. Thank you, Kevin. Chu, Chris, Clara.
So our group voted for packages, not line by line. Our goal was to compromise. And so I don't think it's fair just to say, hey, since everybody has something similar like the 3% cap, we should just move that forward to the package, because that's tied in with vacancy decontrol, like I said before. I think maybe if we're going to go that route, let's vote for packages, versus line by line. Let's vote for packages instead, because if that's the case, then I'll vote for Group 3.
Councilmember Tolbert.
Yeah, thank you. just to talk about I think every conversation that folks had from every group, what I've heard and what we've heard here today is it was packages, it wasn't individual things. And just wondering, obviously we're trying to get some consensus here. It looks like all four groups, they might not have specific what a decontrol looks like, but they all mention some sort of decontrol. And some say full, some say banking, some say partial. I think unless we want, if we're voting on this individually, a lot of stuff might get voted down unless we say, especially the 3%, because I fully agree that every conversation that I heard was 3% and some sort of decontrol were married together. I think to get some sort of, if we're looking for an actual recommendation out of this group, some sort of 3% and a form of decontrol mention, I think needs to be put together, because otherwise I think you're going to leave this group with having to vote down, which I don't think anybody wants to do, which I think you see all the people who voted and negotiated on this stuff. All these things are kind of married together. So I don't know why is decontrol taken out if it's just different forms of decontrol from every group that came out.
Thank you, Clara, and then B.
So it's a 3% cap that's tied to the rent stabilization policy. I disagree with Tober. If we want to vote individual lines, we can do that. You didn't say nothing about no full package. So 3% cap. They should have thought about the full vacancy decontrol before they voted for 3% cap. It's just a flat out 3% cap. We already had these conversations. Why are we going back having these same conversations? Here it is, almost 2:00.
B.
I will say that I'm again, this is my last time saying that we need to move the actual fuck on into the conversation of vacancy control and other housing restrictions. We as renters, and especially me in the renter group that I was in, we did not have our package represented here at all, yet we still voted on it. So we have done a lot of compromising. We've done a lot of negotiating. We've done a lot of things on our end, and we need to move on. The fact that the fact that so many of you want to derail the conversation is beyond to me. The fact that we're still having this conversation when it's almost 2 o'clock, I think we need to just move on and talk about the items already. 3% is agreed upon across the board. And now you're telling me that there's something else that's attached to it. This makes no sense. And I feel like we already were told how we're going to do the setup. We're already told how we were going to go about this process. Why now do we want to change it? And why aren't the facilitators doing enough to say that we need to stick to this? If we're going to have a conversation, then we save that for later, but let's move on to the points that we already have a disagreement about. I'm so over having this conversation. We need to move on. I will not be back here next week because I am on volunteer time and I don't get paid for this. And the fact that you still want to sit here and waste my time is beyond me. I'm so over it. Move on.
See, Terrence.
I guess just the one thing that I'm noticing. Obviously, we're not trying to change this. 3 out of the 4 groups have banking within their conversations.
See, Terrence, we can't hear you. It's we can hear you, but very, very garbled.
Can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay, about that. I'm just noticing where the conversation is on, and where folks are looking forward. Obviously, there's half the group folks that want to just move on and vote in this these highlighted items. But on the aspect of decontrol, Ed, can I just ask you a question? If there's full vacancy decontrol with banking, is that effectively partial decontrol for 3 out of the 4 groups?
Well, if it's vacancy decontrol only through banking, then it's partial decontrol.
Right. So can group 3 just clarify, was the banking meant to be a cap during between tenants in your proposal?
No.
No. Okay.
Group 3 was for full vacancy decontrol and then a separate banking provision.
Okay. All right. Well, never mind. Then yeah, I think you're on the right track in terms of voting for the highlighted and moving on from there. I don't think there's another way to move this discussion forward.
Great. Going to go to Robbie and then call the question.
Great. Really quickly. So yeah, group 3, the banking was for the current tenant so that the property owner would be able to bank during that current tenancy, and then at the end of that tenancy have vacancy decontrol. I just want to state that no way trying to delay or sabotage this, and I am also here as a volunteer. I'm not getting paid to be here. I think a lot of us are here as volunteers, so just want to get this done right. And so rushing a vote through, I understand that you want to get this done quickly and the passion behind it, but I also want to get it done right. And I think it's important that people have their opinions understood and that they know what they're voting for. So I just wanted to make that clear. This isn't a stalling technique or trying to go back on a vote.
Yeah, it is. That's what you're doing. You're stalling.
Please let him finish. Please let him finish.
So he ain't talking about nothing.
Robbie, please go ahead.
No, sorry. So yeah, I just it's not a stalling technique. So these 2 things are very tied together, and I think that's illustrated through the fact that so many people are bringing that up. Thank you.
So I'm going to call the question here, and here's the way I'm going to do it. This is just based on all this discussion, listening to everybody. I understand people have strong feelings, and also we want to get this right. We're going to take a vote on the 5 highlighted items, and depending on the results of that vote, how that goes, we could also then move to the suggestion that a number of people have made, taking a vote on the 4 highlighted items without the rent cap. Does that make sense? So first, we're going to vote on the 5 bundled together that were the items of overlap in 3 or more of the groups, just as I laid out at the beginning. Take a look at the results of that. And if the group wants to move forward with a vote to see if it comes out differently without the rent cap specified, to then come back to that after our discussion of decontrol, we will take that as a separate vote. Does that make sense? And the way we're going to do the votes is this Word document on the screen, and then the poll will just say yes or no. It won't say the language we're voting on. So the language we're voting on is on the screen right now. And that way, as we go forward with other votes, we can be, changing the language as we go up until the point that we vote, and not needing to get it into the, into Zoom. someone asked the question, what does preferential rent banking mean? Well, maybe I'll just let the experts answer that. Ed, do you want to give the answer on that?
Well, it's just what we've been talking about, that the ability to bank preferential rents that that property owners have been giving. So that's just the banking provision.
Just to clarify though, you mean unlimited rent, unlimited banking?
Well, at this point, this is just some form of preferential rent banking, because that's what the agreement, it appeared in 3 of the proposals, but in slightly different forms. So this is just the principle of rent banking in some way.
Right. And to Kevin's question, this is not an attempt to get all of the specifics that the city council will need to consider and the mayor will need to consider and to develop. Same goes for just cause eviction, was just put into the chat. 3 of the 4 groups said we should have protections, just cause protections for renters. There's a lot of devil in the details. There's legal history there. This is just a sense of general policy direction. Maya.
I'm just a little worried because of the time that we all spent drafting proposals and how the Public Safety Committee came together based upon the design of this current conversation. So I'd really like, and I think it's important, and I refuse to vote line by line until I'm shown how that Public Safety Committee came together, because I think we are supposed to be voting on proposals at this point. And I want to look back at the design and I want to make sure that we're all on track before we take a vote on line by line. I think it's crucially important.
So just to be clear, this isn't a vote on line by line. This is a vote on a high level policy direction of the 5 items that there was overlap in 3 of the 4 groups, supported by different people from different stakeholder perspectives in the small groups we spent the last 3 weeks on.
So I understand that, but the job that we were tasked with was drafting a proposal. Then proposals were voted upon, and then we were supposed to bring our proposal forward, and then the big group was supposed to decide which proposal to move forward with from there. I'd really like to understand that better with the public safety and the way that was designed before we move forward here, even drafting whatever's been highlighted. I want to make sure that we're following the same design procedures, and I'm sure, Ed, do you have access to that, please?
The process that we laid out wasn't necessarily that we would adopt one of the 4 proposals that came, is that would serve as the basis for the conversation in the full group, which is, I think, what we're trying to follow at this point.
Thank you, Ed. So we're going to move ahead with a vote on these 5 together. And as I said before, we can also then move to a vote that takes out the rent cap, depending on the results of this one, whether we get enough support.
All right, Philip, I have on my side, I have the poll question put together. Let me know and I can go ahead and launch the question.
Go ahead, and just, I forgot to note that the way this is set up in Zoom, we will be able to track the individual to the vote. So this is a public vote on this package, just as all our votes will be. And when our final report is put together, it will be reported out accordingly.
So I just want to clarify, there's still questions in the chat about what we're voting on. So if maybe just say one more time, what's the...
We are voting on these 5 items as a package, the 5 items that were in 3 or more of the packages of recommendations that came out of the 4 small groups.
Okay, if there are no other clarifying questions, then I will launch the poll question.
And we'll just give a minute for people to get those in. I don't know if you can track, Tony, how many have come in. And if people are putting it's fine to put comments in the chat, but votes won't be counted from the chat.
So I have 30 votes in right now.
And do we have a count on how many of the task force members are present?
I count 44 total members minus 6 that I've identified as either Cura or city staff, which would put us at 38. But we might just want to, if somebody wants to check my math on that.
And just ask also, is anyone having trouble voting through the polling function? Chu, is this related to the getting the votes in?
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering if we could just vote and say what we're voting for, just in case there's any anything that happens, you know, with the vote. If we could just vote publicly.
We are, yeah. The polling function is tied to your name, so yes, it is a public vote. That is important.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we've been at 35 for a minute or two now. So unless there's any objections, I'm going to end the poll.
Yeah, just please speak up if you have not been able to vote and want to, or say so in the chat. Okay, go ahead, Tony.
All right. The poll has ended. I'm sharing the results right now.
Remarkable. So that is 60%, which folks will remember is the threshold for a recommendation. 90% was our threshold for a strong recommendation. I would say based on that result and based on all the discussion, I would suggest we now move to a vote that takes the rent cap out and see what that comes out as. That will also be a public vote. And we'll see if there's a difference there. And then we will proceed, and Tony will take over. We'll proceed into the discussion of vacancy decontrol. Appreciate everybody working together through this process. I know it's a lot to take on, but we were able to vote on one package. We know those results. That will be reported. We will now take another vote on a package that doesn't have the rent cap for the reasons that a number of people have pointed out, and that too will be reported.
Can we put that back up on the screen just for clarity?
Tony, are you able to do that?
Ed's got the, Ed has that.
Is this what you meant, or did you mean the poll results from the first vote?
No, that's what I meant. Thank you.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, so second vote is the same package, but without specifying a recommendation on the rent cap. And if you can run the poll, Tony, that would be great.
Okay, if everything's set, I'm going to open up the poll.
How are we doing in terms of responses?
We're at 28. Last time we had 35.
Okay, so give some more
Getting
time.
close.
I don't have that option on my screen, yes or no. I just have question 2 posted on my screen.
Did you have it on the first?
Yes.
Round? You did, okay. Not sure why that would be the case.
It's only posting a question, not the yes or no
I
option.
wonder if the poll is hiding behind one of your windows, if you moved something on your screen.
I don't have anything
I
else
have a
on my
time limit
screen.
because I was still thinking it disappeared on me too, so maybe it was a time limit.
It's still open. It's still open.
You want
Tony,
me to
maybe
put
you
it
can
in the
close it
chat?
and relaunch it, just in case people are having.
Should we just
technical difficulties.
relaunch and start over?
Yeah, just relaunch question 2.
Okay.
Thanks.
Let's see if it'll let me reopen it. Okay. It will. Okay, so I will reopen the poll. Let's try this again. This will clear the results from before. So please vote again. It's on the same.
There you
same
go.
thing as
Thank
before.
you.
Okay.
Is anyone not seeing the poll? Chu?
You know, I'm like really confused right now. I'm looking at this and I'm like, is this a package? You know, because just cause eviction is tied to the 3% as well. So
You certainly can vote against it if those things are tied for you. But again, these are just the elements that were in 3 or more of the sets of recommendations that came out of the small groups. We understand all those were compromise. There was compromise that happened in all of those discussions that led to those packages.
okay, so basically, if I don't want just cause eviction, then I'll just vote no, right? That's what you're saying?
No, it's up to every task force member to look at this as a set of things that came through 3 or more of the groups and decide whether it warrants a yes vote or a no vote. I think people have very different ways of approaching that thought process depending on their priorities and their perspective. How are we doing in terms of votes in?
We're at 33.
And it was, did you say 35 on the last one?
It was 35 the last time, so we're at 34 now.
This is Rich Holst. I just pulled in.
Sorry, I didn't understand what you said, Rich.
Just letting you know I'm here now, so the count might be different.
Oh,
I think I missed question 1, perhaps. So I don't know if I can still answer that. Hopefully.
Yes, we will try to figure that out. You mean you just joined the meeting?
Yeah, question 2 was up when I joined.
Got it. Understood. Okay. What number are we at now?
We're at 34.
Give 30 more seconds in case somebody's still making up their mind. Okay.
All right, we're at 35.
Oh, good. Okay, let's go ahead with the results then. So 34% in favor, 66% opposed. So pretty strong result there, that this package without the 3% is not a recommendation. And I just want to again acknowledge a lot of comments people have made about how the issue of decontrol in particular was tied together with the cap in your discussions and in your small group recommendations. That's all fair game for continued discussion now that we get into talking about decontrol, and we can talk further about the cap. Appreciate everybody participating in the first 2 votes, and we'll turn it over to Tony to take up decontrol.
And thank you. I mean, I think it's very dangerous that people, I think what we did right there was interesting. If we said we're voting on single items, but then we voted on packages the same, because anyone that voted for number 1 should have voted for number 2, because they weren't voting on the packages, they were voting for the individual things inside the packages. So I can understand why there's some clarity and confusion around that. That being said, if we are moving on, to the area of rent decontrol, which everyone, I don't say agree, but everyone negotiated to some form of decontrol, where you had two groups that were very strong on complete decontrol, and two other groups that had decontrol through banking. And as I understand, it is decontrol through banking. And you can let me know from your groups, was that if you did not raise the rent the maximum 3%, when you had tenant turnover, you were allowed to raise it up to that banked number, and that was a limit. Is that correct, Ed and Phil?
That's correct. Those two groups called for decontrol through preferential banking. So if you banked, then at a vacancy, you could make that up.
Right. So everyone did agree on some form of decontrol, and I guess it will be interesting to see how the group split as we vote, as we will not vote yet, but as we look for ways to discuss the difference in that. And some groups were very adamant about it and tied it to, they felt they negotiated in somewhere else, and other groups negotiated in the proposal to have some form. And so going forward, before we get to the point where we just have to vote and it's all or nothing, we would like to figure out, is there any options of decontrol that are not full vacant recontrol, or not decontrol through banking, that people want to bring to the table as we continue to look at options that we may be able to get consensus on. Ravi, you're going to speak?
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about what our option was. So part of the thing we're looking at is trying to keep the rent down for the current tenant. And the way the policy is currently set up, there's a lot of concern about landlords or property owners feeling the need to raise the rent 3% year over year automatically to cushion themselves or insure themselves, basically just knowing that there is not going to be vacancy decontrol. So what we felt was that in my proposal was that having the ability for the property owner to bank during a current tenancy up to 5 years was what we had stated, and to be able to use that banking during that tenancy, and after the 5-year period it would go away. And then when the tenant moved out voluntarily, or if there was a lease violation, then vacancy decontrol would come into effect, and the landlord or property owner would be able to reset. We felt that that part of it, that decontrol part of it, also would be kind of an incentivization for the property owner to keep that rent down on the current tenant. So that was kind of the thinking behind that. And you know, I think the way it stands, without that vacancy decontrol, I think more landlords will be feeling they need to raise that rent year over year. Whereas if we kind of approach this in a different way, maybe they won't feel that they need to. Another thing I just want to bring up too is we had also added that the city could consider further incentivizing the property owner to not raise the rent by offering property tax credits or homestead exemptions, that type of thing during a current tenancy.
I think we're gonna, you know, that is partially decontrol, but I think as we are gonna come up with some other suggestions in round 4, I think that's a great suggestion there. So we'll look for different things that aren't one of the major ones, that, you know, whether they're tax pass-throughs or breaks, and some of the other things, training, registries, we'll discuss next. Is there any other forms of decontrol that people thought about. I know I see in group 3, they had a property tax pass through. That's one thing. Utility pass through. I don't know if that was on a yearly basis or through decontrol. But for the subject of decontrol, does anybody have any other creative ideas that could get us from full vacancy decontrol to from between that and partial through banking?
Just to clarify, Tony, I'm sorry. I don't think group 3 can clarify this, but I think those pass-throughs were not methods of decontrol. I think those are just additions to their proposal, but group 3 can clarify that if that's different.
So those we could drop down and then there was one question whether about reasonable return on that, but we can drop that in the next section. So a lot of quiet people now, but so as we look to
Kyrie has his hand up, by the way.
Okay. All right. Kyrie.
Thank you, B and C, Terrence. I appreciate that. I'm just going to make a practical point at this, along with a little backstory. As I understand it, looking at all the different proposals, everything else that we'd consider over the next 45 minutes would subject fewer units and maybe less stringent enforcement to the ordinance, in which case, this is me speculating, but it's an educated speculation that we're not going to reach a 60% consensus on any of those items, given what we've already agreed to. And so quite honestly, I'm considering whether or not to spend the rest of the 45 minutes here. And I think that's a completely practical point for the folks who have already achieved the question 1 with the 60% consensus. I shared this with Philip, but my concern is that I don't, at least speaking for myself and no one else in my group, I wouldn't have agreed to. My understanding was that we were going to vote on individual packages of the 4, which one to take up and move on from there. Right. And because that would have taken into consideration all the concessions and the trade-offs that each of us made in our groups. And so because we haven't had that process, but we already do have a set of recommendations coming from this group, I really think it quite honestly might be a waste of time to have the rest of this conversation, because I don't see, and the folks who agree with this can speak for themselves, why would they agree to any vacancy decontrol, anything on preferential banking or subsidized units if they've already got a set of recommendations that is their lowest negotiating point? So that's just my perspective. I think honestly we might be saving time.
So thank you for that. You know, and I hope it's not wasting time, but at the end of the day, if we can't agree on something, we will go to the city council and give them and say, we know that we've agreed on some form of decontrol, and the city council will take our advice and make a decision based on what they heard or what they feel. But we can still give them, you know, what 60% of us or more came through, agreed on. You know, one thing that came up before is, you know, I see something in there that said we're worried about evictions. How do people feel like if somebody decided to move out of their place and they signed a waiver that said they did that on their own, would they be willing to offer decontrol then? Because it would be cleared not an eviction if the tenant said, I want to move out, and signed a waiver saying that it was under no coercion. Is there any thought on that? And I know I see B answering a question.
You know, oftentimes renters are put in situations where they are forced into coercion, even if they sign a piece of paper that says that they're not. So we need to think about those tenants who are undocumented or who might not know a lot of English, and how predatory landlords would be in that situation. So that for me is just like a no, which is again, like it creates more problems than solutions. So that's just my thinking on it too. So wanted to offer that. And yeah, it's just no.
I just want to add that those are actually known as soft evictions. Those are happening now. And being that I assist people in getting rental assistance, that's already happening and that's not working. So.
And see, Terrence, do you have your hands up?
Yeah, I just have a couple comments. I think for the folks who are very worried that this is sort of a zero-sum game and we're not gonna, Kira's gonna write a report from all of this. Of course, we've been part of all these conversations and our report will reflect the conversations. We know that y'all make concessions in developing these packages, and I think that will be reflected in the final report too. So I think there's still a point to y'all still participating in this process because it's still a chance for you to make your voice known. And I'll also just say lastly that, I think the tenants, at least in my group and group 4, conceded to partial decontrol through banking because there was just cause in there as well too. And so the concessions go through multiple aspects of these policies. And so I would encourage y'all to continue to engage, knowing that this isn't a zero-sum game. We're going to reflect this full conversation and what the interests were in our final report to the council and the mayor's office as well too.
Right. And so with Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that we should do a second vote on, or not second vote, but we should talk about this decontrol. I think the majority of the group already agreed to some type of decontrol already. So I think we should have this discussion and do a vote on this to add along with the 2 votes that we already done. And for me, I'm for full decontrol, by the way.
So we voted on the packages that, or the line items that were in all the packages. Would we see, Terrence, your hand still up? Philip?
I was just building on the last comment. I'm sort of speaking as an individual here, not as co-chair. It just seems to me like there's quite a range between full decontrol and the very limited form of partial decontrol that came out of groups 2 and 4. And I, for one, think it would be good to explore together, on that spectrum of options. Is there somewhere that could get enough support here to be a recommendation to city lawmakers? That would seem like very important direction on a high priority item. I don't know if we can get there or not, but I think it's worth a try.
I think Scott's got his hands up.
Okay, Scott?
So on Philip's point, so I had a middle ground proposal on decontrol in our group that didn't carry the day, but I'll just put it out there. And I don't know, Tony, how you had asked if there's any other proposals. I'll put it out there. I don't know what you're thinking in terms of how we would vote on this, but the middle ground was decontrol with a cap, and the cap was based on Oregon's anti-gouging law, which is CPI plus 7.5%. So when a unit becomes vacant, it'll be subject, the rent could be adjusted subject to that cap.
So that is one more option. That's a different middle ground. And, I do encourage people to come up with ideas that are middle ground, or to figure out options if we don't think that we can come up with something that we'd agree upon. And we do have the right to say, you know what, this one is split, too much, and we can ask the city council to make the decision on that. Tron?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, let me put down my hand. I just want to elaborate a little bit on what our conversation was in group 4. So, obviously our group successfully came to some middle ground because there were folks who wanted full decontrol and there were folks who wanted full control. And one of the things that we discussed and, was voted on in our group is that partial vacancy decontrol would happen via preferential banking, where a property owner could, cash in on their preferential banking at the end of a tenancy, which removes the potential harm of someone getting economically evicted in the middle of their tenancy. And then we also, we did not, so I want to make clear, we did not vote on this as a group, but I'm just naming it now that we're having a separate conversation about vacancy decontrol and control, that there are cities that do preferential banking, and they, for example, Oakland limits banked increases to 3 times CPI and doesn't allow banking for a period of greater than 10 years. So I think it probably won't be fruitful for this group to have a very specific conversation about where exactly a cap should be for preferential banking. But I think I would propose that we, in our recommendations to council, name that preferential banking come with some limits to protect renters.
And B?
Yeah, I agree with Trom. I also want to just like we keep talking about the middle ground, but I just want to voice what pro rent control people have already like kind of given up in terms of like what we were discussing. So we already are getting some form of vacancy decontrol. It's not full decontrol, but we still agree to it. We also still allowed for a new construction exemption. And we like, those are two big things that we were trying so hard to not like change, but we let it change for the sake of just coming up with a compromise. So for me, talking about anything other than the middle ground that we already talked about is just giving away my values and giving away the reason why I joined this group. And I think that is just not what I'm going to honestly do. I think we already came up with a middle ground, and I just want to voice what Kyrie already said. I'm not going to really go for full decontrol or really want to do anything that's going to be already what I agreed on, and which is public here. So just taking that into consideration, because there's been a lot of compromise already. And I know you're going to say that both sides have been doing compromises, but us as people who really passed this policy and had the conversations with renters, it took a lot for us to even agree to some of these things. So take that into consideration, especially given that it's seeming like we want to continue to stray away from the middle and go towards one side. I just want to voice that.
Right. And I will restate sort of what you said. There was some compromise on the decontrol. The city said that they were already going to do the new construction. So I just wanted somebody else will clarify that. So factually, but I do feel both sides are very far apart from where they're beginning, and both sides are having to compromise a lot from where you both are beginning. So I don't want to acknowledge that one side is compromising more than the other, but nobody is where they want to be, which could be a good thing or not. And that said, I guess in the spirit of it, then we should vote on either the two policies up here, full control and then partial decontrol. And if we come up with one, we can keep going farther. We may already know the results of them, but as a process, I think we have to follow the same process we followed before. So Ed, are you able to do that?
Sure. We'll get the next polling question up, and it will give two options.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So I understand that we're in a space of negotiation, and the two things that we're voting for are, can you rename what we're voting for, please, Tony?
Full vacancy control or partial vacancy control?
Full control or or partial?
Full decontrol or partial decontrol? Because those are the things in the packages that we have.
I think that if we are talking about meeting in the middle and negotiation, then having an option that is full decontrol or having an option that is full control, right? Either ends of those spectrums are not middle grounded. So I would, I would want us to have, I'm sorry, I'm not done. I would encourage us to have more conversation about what the middle ground is, like you had just started, right? So I would either want us to discuss more options for partial, because I think any vote on any extreme is not in the spirit of negotiation. So I would, I think enough groups have talked about have talked about partial decontrol being what they're willing to vote on, depending on what the details are. So I would encourage us to not vote on either spectrum, but rather either end of the spectrum, but something in the middle.
And I respect that candidly. Trying to respect the process and hearing from all the voices, which I have to do. Everyone was forced to vote on packages that were here. And these are the two packages that are here: full vacancy decontrol or partial. Just like you could vote on 3% or not, because that's what was on the sheet that you've already agreed to. And that's what the other side is going to come and say, how come we couldn't negotiate 3%, but now we have to negotiate this? So we can go on and vote on two options, and it, you know, it's based on the other two votes, it's less likely to win. But in following the same process as everyone wants to do, I'm voting on things that are on the sheet. And if we come to a partial decontrol, we can come up with a solution. And if we can't, we will still have to not give a recommendation over decontrol, because as a group, we can't come to something. So do you still have your hand up, or is that from before?
Yeah, I still have my hand up, because if I had known that I didn't have to negotiate, then I would have put vacancy control in my proposal. I think this vote is unfair for those who have chosen to actually negotiate, because I would have taken a stance of vacancy full control if I'd known that we would be voting on it. So now my ability to negotiate in this space is being compromised, because I actually can't compromise, because now I'm being forced to vote between things that aren't compromised.
And that's what the other group is saying about the 3%, exactly the same thing that they said 10 minutes ago. And they were disgrouted and told them they already voted for something, and they agreed upon it, and they have to go through with it. So everyone has to, I mean, I'm hearing it from both sides. And so 10 minutes ago, they said you had to vote on 3% because you already agreed upon it. And they said that was our compromise with something else. And we said, and that's what it is. So I'm just trying to follow the same process here, and vote on what's here on the paper, which is what we forced everyone to do 15 minutes ago. And that's what we said the last hour about the 3%. And that's why the other group has been writing things in the chat saying, we wouldn't have put 3% if that was our negotiation point. So again, and you're starting to see it in the chat, and I'm only trying to be consistent in this room right now. I know, Ed, can you get ready for this vote? And then Clara, can you state what your case is?
So Tony, just like I put in the chat, vacancy decontrol goes against the rent stabilization policy, right? So why would we vote on something that's not going to protect the renters? It's just a one-sided story here, like she was saying. But why would we vote on something that we're not in agreement with?
Well, if everyone votes against it, then we'll feel like where the group sits on this based on the whole package. 2.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what you said, Tony, because it seems like we didn't really say it. But yeah, we compromised a lot on the other side with the 3% already. You know, if we knew that we're going to be able to still negotiate, I would not have done the 3%. It would have been 3% plus some type of index, or 3% plus something else, right? So we already compromised on the other side too, and we were forced to vote on it, which is fine, right? So it's the same thing here. So I just, think we should just vote.
So Ed, can you put up a poll again? If we don't come up with a conclusion over 60%, we won't be putting on anything. And we've also asked for different partial ones. And after this, we may vote on those as well. So Ed, will you put up the vote?
Sure. So to Tony Damiano, Tony, can you put together a poll that has these two options?
Yep, working on it, almost there.
Okay.
So the vote is based on the things that we already agreed upon. Are people wanting full vacancy decontrol or partial vacancy decontrol in some form?
I think it should be a yes or no vote for a full vacancy decontrol, and then a yes or no vote for partial vacancy decontrol, right?
Well, no, because it's going to be one or the other.
Yeah, but like if yeah, I guess that's fine.
Scott?
So to Tu's points, I think there's a lot of people that might be in favor of either. If we can get full, they might be in favor of full, but might also be willing to support partial.
Well, if you get, but those are your only two choices. So if you don't vote for full, you will get partial, because that's what everyone wrote in there. Now, the partial hasn't been decided what it looks like, but it's basically everyone's agreed on a record. No one's, in none of these negotiations did someone put down that there should be no decontrol.
I did, but it got ignored. But
Right. Well, it didn't get, it wasn't in any of these proposals, and you guys voted and agreed upon that as the final four proposals. It wasn't in either one of them. It wasn't in
yeah,
any of the
it's
final
almost
four
like
proposals.
they was on purpose, but we're still voting, so let's just vote.
Again, we force people to vote on things that they didn't personally agree upon or pieces of it. We're only voting on things that people agreed upon that are in these four proposals. And not everyone has everything that they wanted in here because it were group decisions. So Tony, do you have the poll up?
Yeah, okay, as written, the options are between full decontrol and partial vacancy decontrol. Give me 1 second here. Question 3, full vacancy decontrol. Okay.
And then as that, we'll be tallying that up. How many people have voted?
We're at 33 right now. 34.
Is there anybody that hasn't voted?
All right. We're at 35. Last call before I end the poll.
So the numbers say that neither one of them hit 60%, but it will be told that now I know what you guys mean about the 60% as a recommendation, but we will put in there that we voted on this, and in all four of them that we had this. Phil, you want to help me out on this one? Or Ed, on the percentages?
Yeah, I think we just report that we took a vote on this and neither position, so we don't have a recommendation to the city council one way or the other.
Okay. And then we were looking at other.
Sorry, Tony. This is what I meant earlier, right?
Right.
Like, if I had a chance to vote on both, I would agree on partial as well.
Right.
So then we would have gotten a percentage. Or I don't know if we would or not, but I think the numbers might have been different.
Right.
So this vote was really just to see what we favor. It's not like a recommendation. Like, it seems like our group just kind of favor partial decontrol versus full decontrol.
Right. I guess you're right, because there was the assumption that we agreed on partial decontrol because we didn't know what form of it, but we couldn't. And that was the option of us to come up with, is there a form that we can come up with that we can all agree on?
Can I just suggest, I mean, why not have an up-down vote on partial decontrol? Because the choices are either to make no recommendation to city council, which does whatever it wants, or to recommend a partial decontrol, which there's a variety of things that can mean, which we could work on in a little more detail to try to come up with, try to find some kind of sweet spot on that.
Not happening.
We can do that.
All right, Tony, can you put in there a vote on partial decontrol in favor of giving the city recommendation of some form of partial decontrol if we don't have the ability to give them an actual option.
Tony, this vote would be simple yes, no.
Right. Yes, Marcus, it is.
Number 4, in favor of partial decontrol.
Kevin, you still have your hand up?
No, sorry, forgot to put it down.
In favor of partial decontrol in some form.
All right, we're at 35. So I will close the poll.
So we will recommend that that the group has recommended some sort of partial decontrol. As we look down to further,
I'm going to interrupt for a second. If you're a renter, I don't know, if you agree with full control, can we just put that in the chat? Because I found the last 2 voting things very confusing. So if you want full control.
I think there's a what people wanting full control, and I think people making a package and a concession. D'Angelo's?
Hey, everyone. To the group of facilitators, I would say to complete this kind of logic model, can we get a thumbs up, thumbs down vote on full decontrol, just so you have those 2 next to each other?
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
No, that does not make sense because we didn't have other things with the 3% cap either. So we compromised so much with the 3% cap already. And that means that we need to go back and vote on the 3%. We don't want to do that.
No, I don't know if you understood what I was saying, because we just did an up down for the partial, and we broke it out separate from an either or decision making where we didn't get 60%. We just found out that 83% are in favor of partial. If we complete the logic model, we will have the same number of how many are in favor for full decontrol, which we would then have a comparison of the entire group for both items as a separate standalone. That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, sorry, that was my mistake.
Right, yeah. I mean, we're assuming that it went past, but if we want to know the exact number, we can. Tony, could you put it in there just so that the group knows the exact number? Ed, Tony?
All right, I think Tony's doing that right now.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I cut out for a second. Do we have a new question?
They just wanted to know, just full vacancy, yeah, that question.
Okay.
Just full vacancy, just to know the number of just a yes, no, just to know exactly how many people actually wanted that.
That would be 3% cap too, because
Chu, you're speaking. Clara, you have a comment?
I'm trying to figure out why we keep voting on the same thing over and over.
It's just to get the same number.
It's just to
figure
prove
out the-
that you, it's just to prove that you really want full vacancy decontrol.
No, because we know that it's not going to be 60%. I think they wanted to do it just because we did partial. So they're just trying to figure out.
Full vacancy decontrol.
God.
Claire, you still have your hand up. You have another question?
I need you to move.
The poll is up.
No, I don't have enough. Let me lower my hand, Tony.
Okay. Tony, how are we doing with those numbers?
We're waiting on three votes.
32 people have voted. 33 now.
Is anyone still trying to vote?
We're on question number 5. If you are in favor of full vacancy decontrol, yes or no?
All right, we can close it.
That's a question in the chat, Tony.
Yes, so Marcus, we're on question number 5.
All right, it's been open long enough. We can close it.
So there we have 44 and 56. In that, so I guess we don't have too much time, but the question is there a partial package that we feel we want to vote on, or do we want to pass that on to the city to decide, which they will decide anyways? But we want to try to find one that we recommend as a group, or do we want to use this time to look at other things that we would like to be a part of this package, and look for things like that we want to add in there and talk about things like workshops, workspace, exemptions, like somebody had an exemption on duplex, some of these other hot exemptions and implementation methods that we had in there. Ed, what do you think about the timeline?
Right. Well, I would just, we've had two suggestions for partial decontrol. One was tied to banking and the other was the recommendation of CPI plus 7%. We can try to see if either of those hits a threshold as a recommendation to the council, or we can move on to other topics.
Okay, so we have, I guess, if we're gonna vote on those two things, the question is do we vote on them as standalones, I guess?
Yeah, let's do that. We're gonna end up doing it anyway, so.
Okay. So let's vote on these as standalone, and again, if
I
we
got
don't
my
have
hand up,
the-
Tony. Tony, I
Oh,
got my
sorry.
hand up as a
Okay, Clara.
facilitator. So
Yep.
I vote that we end this discussion and we can all vote on that together and let the city council do their job. Because we don't have time for that. We only got 9 minutes and then we'll have a full discussion about this. So y'all stalled all afternoon, so that's on y'all. But I vote, if everybody want to vote with me, to let city council do their job, because they're not definitely doing their job. Some city council members, let me say that. So I vote, like you just said, I vote on what you just said. Let the city council take this up and do their job. Because it's not speaking, Tony, it's not speaking for the renters. We just going back and forth with the landlords and these corporate developers. So let the city council decide what they want to do for the boards or whatever you were saying.
Philip?
I was just gonna say, when I look at the table, I know we don't have it in front of us, but when I look at the table with the results from the recommendations from the 4 groups, I see a lot of items that seem worth further discussion and consideration, and where I think we might be able to get to 60% or higher for a recommendation. I don't know that, nobody knows that, but I hope that we can come back next week and continue to think those through. And if we can give the city council more direction, that would be good.
I'm not coming back next week. I'm not coming back next week. I'm not.
Bill?
I personally, I just agree with Clara, and I don't think it's like a one side or another. Like I think this is a good place to stop. There's a lot more of this process to go on. The city council will have a long conversation about it, and we're passing everything on to them. I think that's pretty clear, right? All the different proposals. So I don't know what more good is going to come of getting into more policy detail.
Well, unless we have any, Philip, is your hand still up?
Nope, sorry about that.
Well, unless we have any other business, then I guess we can adjourn. I know this has been contentious and it's been a long time, and there's probably, I don't know if anyone is completely happy. Some people are probably happier than they thought they would be, and some people are more disappointed. It is a process that we're trying to follow. We hope everyone stays reflected. If people were offended on here, it wasn't intentional. So I apologize on behalf of our facilitators and co-chairs and for other members that may have done so unintendedly. This is not easy work, and these are serious issues that affect a lot of people in a lot of different ways. So we appreciate your time being here. We hope everyone shows up next week, because we still have some other things. We still have some other things that we feel like we can get to a consensus. And I will turn it over to Kira to answer the last question about when the report will be done, and that obviously will happen after next week's meeting, and we come up with more recommendations.
Tony, can I get clarification? Because I sincerely thought today was the last day that we will have a meeting about this stuff here. I mean, we should
Okay.
just be waiting for the report. Is that clear now? I'm not coming next week, whether you hold a meeting or not. This was supposed to be
Okay.
the last meeting that we were supposed to have. Can we get clarification on that?
Yep, we will, and I think we have it scheduled in case there's other issues that we did not get to today time-wise. But Kira, you want to go answer about that question?
Sure. This was the last scheduled meeting that we had, but we had a break, an open date on 1 week from today, June 14th, set aside to meet if we still had other items to consider. The final report is due on June 24th. And so that's when we are targeting the delivery of the final report. So even if we meet on the 14th, we'll be able to incorporate whatever final decisions are made at that date.
So shouldn't we make a decision whether or not if we are available to meet next week versus a meeting that's already be scheduled? Like if we're already determining, or if some of us are in agreement that city council should be taking the rest of this on, is there a need to have another meeting? I mean, because it seems like to me there wouldn't be a need.
Ed?
Well, if the task force decides that they don't want to meet any longer, that they have made all of the decisions they want to make, then you have that right. There are still some things that we haven't made a decision on, but if you guys are tapped out and you don't want to meet, we can't make you meet. So it's really up to you in the end.
Well, why don't we set one last vote in 4 minutes? Who wants to attend the meeting next week and go over things that we haven't got to, and we will have everyone's voice. Tony, one last vote. We're meeting next week to come up with some more recommendations or not?
All right, I'm on it.
Ed, will this report go to the group before the mayor sees it?
Yeah, we'll send a draft around.
Tony, I'm seeing the results from question 5. I don't know if other people are seeing that
Same. Yeah, I'm also seeing the results from 5.
rather than a new poll.
Yeah, that's weird. Okay, here we go. I think we're good. Should the task force meet next week? Yes or no? Launched.
Can we include this in the report if it gets above 60% now?
I'll give everybody another 30 seconds.
30 people have voted.
Okay, 31 have voted.
I think that's enough, Tony. Let's just close it. We'll get a
Okay.
general sense.
Majority are not in favor.
Well, given that result, I'll just step in again. Sorry, I'm not on camera, but just to thank everyone here for your service, for stepping up when you were asked, and putting a tremendous amount of time and energy into what has been a contentious and at times really difficult process. But just appreciate everyone's commitment to our city.
I would like to add to that. thanks for your patience for doing this over Zoom. This would obviously have been a much easier process had we all been in the same room. The difficulties of the technology made this pretty clunky, but I think I want to thank you for persevering on that.
Thank you, everybody. I don't know if we can celebrate, but we can celebrate that we don't have to come next week. I know it was difficult. We all love St. Paul. I hope that's something we all have in common, right? So I know it's a tough day for some people, or for all everybody. It takes a lot of energy, but we do all love St. Paul. So let's keep that going as well.
Thanks, everyone.